Good morning. It is afternoon even. It feels like I should be saying morning because it's pews and it's church and that's normally morning, isn't it? I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. When Richard asked me to do this, I have to say I'm trying to write a book this year, and what that means is that you say no to everything people ask you to do. But this is a very unusual gig for me, and I really wanted to come and to do it. And I have spent, maybe about 6 months probably thinking about what I wanted to say today. And the research bit of it was really easy. But it started me thinking about praying and how you might pray and what some of the things that I've learned through research might teach us about how to pray. And I kept singing in my head, or what came to me as I started writing things through was Wesley's hymn, Love's Divine or Love's Excelling. So I've spent 6 months basically singing that to myself, and I've really enjoyed it. And this week, more than ever, as I've tried to actually pull these messages into somewhat of a coherent talk. And I think I say that because what I want to do is tell you today 7 criminological take-homes, things that I would like you to know to renew not just your heart, your soul, but also to love God with your mind as well, things that are true, that we know to be true as of our knowledge today, which obviously might change over time. And they're the bits that I feel really sure of. I've tried then to think about how they might interact with the bits that we pray, and I think that they're the bits that would be really good to discuss, because I'm certain in this room I have less expertise than most around that. I have got to this point of talking about these things because I have spent the last probably 15 years of my life, quite a lot of it, spending time with people in prison and post-release from prison. They have taught me an awful lot, and I think part of what I will be talking about today is maybe less about their rehabilitation and more about rehabilitation of us all. So, let me start. The first take-home message, now I have to hold this the right way around. Oh, that's right. Is that love matters. We know from science, social science, so some people might call soft, but I quite often found it quite hard. We know that whether or not you have been convicted of committing a criminal offence, research shows us that both loving and being loved really matters to positive futures. So last week I had the joy, and it was a joy because it doesn't happen very often, of being in a room with a whole load of policymakers from lots of different departments, including the Ministry of Justice, and a very new appointee, who's the Deputy Director of our Prisons and Probation Service, Stephen O'Connor, held up this book, The Triumphs of Experience, and said it was his favourite book. And he said it's a study of 268 men who studied in Harvard from 1938 onwards, as some of them are still alive in their 90s, and it's a study of their life outcomes. And the findings of all of those years and millions of dollars worth of study, George Vaillant, the author, says, is that happiness is love. Full stop. In that book, one of the things they point out won't surprise us, which is that a loving home matters for future outcomes. So obviously what I did, having not read it, was bought it very quickly and started to read it. And I have told Stephen how much I've enjoyed it and that I would be talking about both him. I loved the fact that our head of prison and probation service, our deputy head, was standing up talking about love in a conference on how we shape policy. Love matters. So I start reading this book. It's telling you the obvious things that we all now know in common knowledge. A loving home matters for our future outcomes. But probably it's also not news to us that a lot of people, the majority of people in our criminal justice system, don't come from backgrounds that are the easiest backgrounds in terms of loving and being loved. Often they have quite fractured and traumatizing experiences that lead to offending. And so the more important message from this book is that while a warm and happy childhood are important, it's not vital, is what this study shows. Some of the men in this study who had the most difficult, the most cold, the most fractured childhoods actually became some of the most successful and happy 90-year-olds. Life is long is another great thing it teaches us, and we keep changing. And why? Well, what this study found was that over the course of their lives, they actually learned how to love and how to be loved. They found ways of coping with life that didn't push that love away. So that over the course of life, even a damaged childhood can be overcome. Those things can change. And in Vallant's words, he said the study found, and I quote him, that the most important influence by far on a flourishing life is love. And while childhood love is important, he writes, it need be neither destiny nor doom. And that study showed that when people find love, they really can change and really can grow. And for some of the men in the studies, that was in their 60s, their 70s, their 80s, later on in life. One of my favourite Bible verses is, I think it's Paul that says it. He says a few things I'm not so keen on, but he says, doubt everything, hold on to the truth. And I think what I'm hoping is that there's some of you sitting there now, and you also like that verse from Paul, and you're thinking, well, that's brilliant, because all those people who went to Harvard probably are not the people who were committing lots of offences. In fact, JFK was one of the people who was in this study. But luckily enough, there's another study, which is called the Gluck study, a study that I was aware of prior to reading this book. And the Gluck study followed the lives of 1,000 disadvantaged men, inner city men from Boston, over a very similar period. And since 1980, there have been some criminologists, Robert Sampson and John Laub, and they have been looking at the results of that study in terms of looking at how people in that people who had been involved in offending that were part of that 1,000 men then moved away from crime throughout their life. And one of the things that they found was that relational aspects are uppermost in those turning points in life. And a lot of those relationships in the books that Robert Sampson and John Laub have written about the men in the Gluck study, a lot of those relationships are romantic. But a lot of them are also religious. People who find faith and find the love of God, who find a faith community and find the love of other people. And some of them are employment-related, joining the army, getting a new job, lots of different things. And the important aspects of those different routes out of crime for those people is that they combine the ability to be individually transformative and also then a sense of how, as an individual who's transformed, I interact with society. So they're also socially transformative. They connect those individuals with a new sense of themselves and then to others, a new sense of to whom I belong. And they are that building blocks of becoming, those social interactions. So basically, the take-home from this is what Voltaire said years and years ago. If anyone has read The Velveteen Rabbit, which I have bought this week and been reading, it's a beautiful story, and it says the same thing. And the scriptures have said it for years and years, but social science will now prove to us that the story of the transformative effects of love that are true for us are true for everyone. And I think that means that Wesley started in a really good place, with love. So pray in love. But as I thought about this, as I wrote it down, I thought, it's easy to say pray in love. What does that actually mean? What does pray in love mean? So I started thinking, and then throwing it up there for our discussions. 1 John 3:16, it means laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters. And I was thinking about the example of Jesus' life, and I thought, well, it couldn't really be that much clearer, right? So at the point that he's sitting down there with his best friends, one of them's about to betray him, one of them's about to commit a crime against him that's going to result in his painful death. And what he does at that moment is gives them a new commandment. Anybody know what it is? John 13:34. Love one another, even as I have loved you. And by this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Which is quite a remarkable commandment to give at the point one of them is about to screw him over in quite a major way. It's a difficult thing. And as if that wasn't quite enough in and of itself, at the moment that crime is coming into its fruition, and he's actually being harmed and hanging on a cross in pain, he shows his friends and his followers what that means, what it means to love each other even as I have loved you, which in the face of being harmed and others that he loves also being harmed, his brother standing there, what is it that he says? For they know not what they do. So prayer, I think, could model that dictum of 1 John 3, the kind of love that could lay down your life for your friend, not just in word or in speech, but also in action and in truth. I mean, what does it mean to pray in action and in truth? So one of the things that the Pray in Love led me to think about is, okay, what kind of criminological truths might tell us some things about praying in action and in truth? So, action, I thought, one of the first things we could do in praying in action is take a good look at ourselves and at honestly loving ourselves. Because I think that's one of the things Jesus did. He knew who he was. He knew that God loved him. He knew he was the Son of God. And he looked at himself honestly and wasn't afraid to have that shown to others. So, if I can get this to work. There we are. We've learned already that in life we're not really self-made. We are formed in relationships. Loved and being loved is important to who we are and to who we become. So we can be humble about the fact that we all need each other and we all need love, but we can also be humble about the fact that actually we are all criminals. So although I started off by saying we've got this study on the people from the Grant study and these are Harvard graduates, and then we've got, it's all right because the messages that we get from that we've got from the Gluck study, and that was on the people who've done offences. This study shows you actually that's not true. Probably people in the Grant study have also committed offences. So I don't know if you could give me a quick click on that website, which hopefully will open up. It's a very good website. Have a look at it. It's one of my favourite pieces of research. What we know is that committing offences and being convicted of committing offences are two quite different things with some quite different results in life. So if you could click on some of these people, you can see who they are, and then you can see some of the things that they've done. If you click further through the website, you will see what's been the results of those offences for some people who've been convicted and what's been the results of them for some people who haven't. We don't have very much research around the comparisons and the roots from crime for people who are convicted and people who are not convicted of offences. But what this research is able to show us is that actually everybody has committed criminal offences. So I wanted to have some fun, and I wanted to plot our offences. So I would like you to talk to the people next to you for a few minutes. I'd like you to think through your life, and I'd like you to think about what criminal offences you have committed. You are going to have to share them. I'm going to ask for some feedback. The reason you talk to each other, obviously, is because it's easier to tell me and everybody else what the person next to you has done than it is to say what you've done yourself. But if you could just have 1 minute to talk to each other, I'd like a few offences that you've committed in life. So can I stop you there? And is anyone kind enough to share someone else's criminal offences with me, or even their own? Come on. Yes, please. There's a hand. Speeding. Okay, we've got some speeders in the. And can I ask? So I want a little bit more information about speeding. I'd like to know when it happens.
It happens quite often, actually.
Okay. When did it start?
Oh, I really don't know. It must have been soon after I learned to drive.
Okay, so it's starting around here, around sort of 17 years old. We've got your age on the bottom here. This is Bramhall Methodist age crime curve. So what we're doing. So we've got your age on the bottom here. Yeah.
The last time I was caught, I've only been caught, I think, twice.
Okay.
Maybe 3 times. 3 times.
So we're interested less in how many times you've been caught and more in the regularity of your offending.
The regularity.
We need to get this on record.
I've been to a driving improvement, one of those courses.
That is important.
I'm more aware now.
Okay. And
The fact that I still do it.
okay. So we've got. Can I be rude and ask you how old you are now?
I am 64.
Okay, so we've got you still offending at the age of 64. Have there been any points throughout your life when you've been speeding more or less? So has it decreased after the courses?
It's been more since I've been about 50.
Okay, so you are. So I'm going to put quite a few up here.
Then there were a couple.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got a speeding. Okay. We'll put that down. Thank you very much. Can we have anyone else? Yes, please. Shoplifting, brilliant. Normative behaviour. If anyone hasn't shoplifted in here, you're weird. That's true. It's true. Yeah. Yeah. Right, young, very young. Uh-huh. And carried on until? Oh, okay. So that wasn't at 65, no? 10, okay. So we've got an early desister. Okay, so we've got you carrying on. Did it happen a few times? Was it a one-off offence or?
Oh, no, regular.
Regular, okay. So we're going to have quite a bit of shoplifting. Yeah, anything else? You're all being very tame here.
I couldn't share with anyone because there's no one sitting next to me.
Uh-huh.
But I'm also...
That's a very good point to make. We should bring that back a little bit later. Yeah.
Down here, shoplifting.
Shoplifting, another shoplifter. You're also normal, sir.
A different outcome.
Oh, right.
I was about 7 or 8.
Okay, young again. Yeah.
Shopping with an aunt or my parents or something. We went to Woolworths. And all the food and the...
Oh, yeah, those pick and mix. Tragic, yeah.
And then I walked past a store which was full of sweets.
Uh-huh.
So, this is a good idea. And I helped myself. They were mothballed.
Oh, unfortunate.
I never, ever again did any shopping.
Right. There we go, got you out of it. Circumstantial desistance. Anyone else?
I've got a speed awareness course coming up in October the 20th.
Another one. So we've got another speeding. Have we got anything that isn't speeding or shoplifting? Can't believe there is no... Go on. Car fines. Oh, I don't think that... We're not going to put those in the criminal bracket quite yet. Yeah. A little. Yeah. Yeah, we've got some violence. Good, I was thinking we needed some violence. Yeah.
My son, well, it is linked to that. When he was 2, according to common assault, he bite one of his friends at nursery school, and it was a very traumatic assault, but he did.
And so I'm not going to include that on here just because, actually, in your 6 and 7-year-olds here, thankfully we haven't quite got to the stage yet where we are criminalising. We're at 10 years old is the age of criminal responsibility in this country, which quite frankly is outrageous and out of step with the whole of Europe, but it wouldn't yet be criminal. But I'd like to come back to the violence over here.
Well, this is, from the age of about 7 to about 14 until the other boys at school were all bigger than me.
Okay, so we've got some violence going on, which is, so I've got you at about 15, I'm putting you down here. And there was, so I'm going to go with, I've had something here, so I'll just go with these two.
Theft.
A theft?
Pens from work. They sort of accidentally happened to
Love it.
not get back to the desk.
Uh-huh. And that was around what age?
Probably about 30.
30. Okay, some theft going on at 30. Yeah. And we had one more, yeah?
We talked about trespassing.
Trespassing. Yeah, there's a question about whether it's an offence or not.
Go places we shouldn't probably be doing.
Teenage years, there's a bit of trespassing. Yeah. Did you commit criminal offences when you were trick-or-treating?
I'll dub Sophie in.
Go on then.
Who's downloading copyright material from the internet.
Nice, very good. And yeah, what age is that?
She's, what are you now, 17? Yeah.
Early today, so we'll put you down here as well. What got last one, and then we'll breaking and entering. That's more like it, yeah. Yeah. After the shoplifting, so a little bit older.
Yeah, moved on to breaking into derelict buildings.
Yeah.
And then from that, I broke into anywhere I found out that there was a pop group on that I liked, and broke into the BBC.
Yeah.
Studio.
Brilliant. Breaking and entering. So we've got that in the teenage years. When did that stop?
When I was 15.
15. So you started desisting at about the age of 15. So we'll have you just before the 20s, and we'll have a breaking and entering. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. So what you will see is that, except for our anomaly here, who is still offending at the age of 65. What we've actually got are some people starting quite young. We've got a bit of a peak going up into our teenage years. We've had mainly women who have responded here, and then they've fairly early, they've started tailing off. So we've got something like this, but quite a lot of offending fairly early on in life at this point is what we've got in Bramhall Methodists. So, what? Is this with David Farrington? I believe I'm going to be showing you one of the graphs that's taken from one of his studies in a moment.
400 working class boys from 3 Lands boroughs.
Yeah, he's still around. And some of that data is coming up, good knowledge, which doesn't look too dissimilar to this, actually. I think, in the interest of humility, I wanted to include my own photograph. And my mum is in the audience, so I'm sorry, Mum, in advance. But these are some of my offences over the years. Most of them, I'm happy to say, while I was a teenager, in line with the age crime curve that we will go to. But what I wanted to say was that there is something about understanding that actually we all commit offences, and I'm often fairly challenged in my own faith to think about what we call criminal offences, which are obviously social constructions of wrongdoing, and what actual offences Jesus might care about. But these are my criminal offences. But Wesley was absolutely no fool when he writes his hymn. It was one of the things that struck me first when it started going through my head a lot, and I started thinking about it in criminological terms. So he starts with love, but then he moves into this humble acknowledgement that every single trembling heart needs that love and compassion, that sense that things can and they do change, that actually you can be saved. And once that is established, he then moves on to take away the love of sinning. So that, in Wesley's hymn, isn't a prerequisite. Stop sinning and then you will be lovable. And then you can come to church, you can pop on the right clothes, you can make sure you look respectable and you don't swear. Don't dare come in smelling of beer. In Wesley's hymn, what happens is that the scriptures taking away that love of sinning doesn't come first. It's a consequence of a love that is humble enough to be fixed in us while we were yet sinners. And I was thinking of Peter, 1 Peter 4:8, where it says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. The love comes first, and the sins, some of which remain, even to the age of 65 onwards, are then covered, and actually social science and criminology would show us begin to dissipate. And as I was thinking about this, I thought about a guy called Darrell, who was in the study I did in Texas of life post-release and the role of faith communities. And I thought about sitting in a church with Darrell, who'd been in prison on and off throughout all of his life from the age of 15 and was really battling with drug addiction. And I sat in that church with him. And it was a church that had quite a lot of recovering addicts in it. And as I sat in the church, they had a little part of the service where they stood up and they celebrated. And what are people celebrating this week? So it'd be one thing and another. And someone stood up and he said, I'm celebrating that today I'm 5 days sober. And then he said, because I've been coming to this church for 3 years. And I had been 3 years sober. But this week I messed up. And so I'm celebrating today that I called my friends and I said, I'm in this church, and I said, I've messed up. And they came and got me and picked me up and brought me back. And I'm celebrating now that I'm back here, I'm still here, I'm messed up, and now I'm 5 days sober and I'm carrying on. And I remember sitting next to him and watching him sort of breathe out that there was a place where you could fail and still belong. It was quite exceptional, and 6 of the people in my study went to that church. So there are some, I think, scriptural reasons to be humble and some good research reasons to be humble, because actually we are all offenders. But there's also some good scientific evidence of why humility might be important to roots out of crime. And that is because we know that stigma and prejudice blight success for people trying to leave a life of crime. So there is several studies by Labelle and his colleagues, a more recent one by him and a study by Moore. And what these studies tell us is that people who both experience and perceive stigma and prejudice are less likely to have positive outcomes in life, and they are more likely to reoffend. And some of those findings stem from some studies in the UK, but there is another study of life post-release in America by Nancy Lavinia and colleagues that was from 2009. And one of the things that study found, which wasn't a study about faith communities, but one of the findings about life post-release, was that people who joined faith communities their being members of a faith community was associated with lower recidivism and with reduced substance abuse rates. But perhaps more importantly than that, what it also found is that those who went to faith communities to join them, but later left those religious organisations at some point, not only lost the positive effects of that association, but had a higher likelihood of substance abuse and recidivism. And their study didn't say why that was. But the men in my study who were dying to join faith communities post-release from prison and who did so told me that it was exceptionally painful to come out and return to the place where you thought you belonged, to realise that you weren't accepted by the people who you thought you belonged with. And LaBelle's later research, so his 2012 paper, shows, and I've cited that in the quote at the bottom, just how important social bonds were. And they're not just important to people's experiences of stigma, but they're important to people's perceptions of stigma. So belonging in a faith community might well not just mean that I have people around whom I don't feel that stigma, but mean that when I am going about my life in all of my different functions, I perceive other people's interactions with me differently, and that is likely to have positive consequences for roots out of crime. And I think, in Wesley's words, that what this means is not just that we have to be humble and pray in humility, but that we have to keep praying in humility. I love this idea of faithful mercies. It's not mercies once, not mercies twice, it's the 70 times 7, it's the faithful mercies. And that, I think, is important, because actually, if we can bring that humility through and to everything that we do, we are more likely to be living out our faith in a way that means that we are reducing stigma and prejudice. And I think this because of something called intergroup contact theory. So intergroup contact theory is a very, very well-established body of work that talks about how you bring together people who might feel that they're different from each other in ways that are more likely to reduce stigma and prejudice. And what they found is that there are 4 conditions under which people can come together that reduce stigma and prejudice. One is where they have equal status, where there are personal interactions, where they're cooperating to achieve a collective aim, and where the overarching narrative of their coming together is supportive, especially by big, important social institutions. And I think faith communities can hardly be more ideal for these characteristics. So there's a sense that there's this equality, everyone's sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We know that story about the rich man, right? That individual perfection won't get you very far. To enter the kingdom of heaven, we need to understand we're bound to each other. We need to understand that we have to share and we have to work together. What I love about that is the idea that we might look at this and think about equal status and intergroup contact theory and how it's going to help the other. But I think the example of the rich man says that actually who it's going to help might be the me as well as the other, the us. There is within churches those personal interactions. There is lots of opportunities to cooperate, and an idea that we have together this sense of what we're trying to achieve together, working towards some collective aim, and that there is this overarching narrative that feeds into all of those 3 things before. So I would say that churches are ideal. But there's a risk. There's a risk of in churches when they're not like that. So in my study in the States, after going to that church with quite a few people that I gave the story of Darryl from, I went and had coffee with the man who was leading that church. And when I had a coffee with him, he talked to me about his theology, which he said wasn't of the ascending Christ, which you often hear within churches. He said it was a story of the descending Christ. He said that he sometimes got frustrated in his church that going to church could be what he called spiritual masturbation. People coming to church and saying, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord, I want to see you." He said, but Jesus is wondering where you are, because I descended into hell. I'm sitting next to people in their hells. I'm in the gutters. I'm in the places that you're not going to. I always cry, and I generally swear, but I think this stuff is worth crying and swearing over. Because there's a sense, and I wrote this at the end of my thesis around the role of faith communities, that I think the faith communities that had a lot of people leaving prison and a lot of people with fractured lives, because the people leaving prison went to faith communities that had lots of different outreaches and lots of different things in the city, not just one specific ministry for people leaving prison. The faith communities that had a lot of people leaving prison in them, were faith communities where their theology was shaped by that. And one of my conclusions was perhaps that it wasn't so much that people leaving prison needed churches, but the churches desperately needed people leaving prison in order to actually stay alive. It reminds me a little bit of Luke 18, a story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, where it's the humble that are exalted.
Sorry, I don't want to be critical, but that seems quite an idealised. I'm just thinking that I was married 40 years ago in a church where the pastor was in and out of probation service and finally at a very senior level. 40 years ago he set up a sort of a centre near the church in which people who went to work and people who were ex-offenders lived here in the community. And it was a shambles, and just went around with that inspired having house parents, and that's because that very fact, Monday morning, the well-meaning in work went to work, and the offenders who were released there went out naked and bleeding. And this pattern, of course, brought a lot of opprobrium from the local community who were saying, well, we've been victims of self-experiments on the part of the church, which is clearly a shambles and isn't working, and it did close.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points. I certainly wouldn't apologise for a church being idealistic. Perhaps that's exactly what the church should do, maybe more methodologically and rigorously. But in the example that you give, and I think some of the things I'm going to go on to say will talk to that example a bit, there is also a sense that the church doesn't have to do everything. That the probation service might need to do quite a lot of things, that employment services might need to do quite a lot of things, that there might be some politics that a church could talk to who were doing the church bits quite well. So there is a danger of overreaching, both in terms of how churches do things when they try to police risk rather than to practice love, and in terms of not relying on the expertise in terms of where it lies, which is that our probation service knows quite a lot about managing risk. And if the church trusted the probation service, and if the probation service trusted the church, they might be able to work quite effectively together to support people who will continue offending. We will get on to that point in a moment. And so sometimes I think there are unrealistic expectations about what that community living might look like, which can mean that it leads to fracture, and some of the take-homes will get to that. And sometimes there is not enough adequate support from people who might do some of the practice that can help to support the ideals. But certainly, I think we don't want to lose our ideals because they are challenging in practice. We might want to cling to them even more. Maybe. We'll see how we go. So the next point, take home, is just to say that where they might have been being ideal, the church in doing this, they're actually standing on good evidence. Because what we know, and this is the Farrington stuff, and this is what we're seeing here, is that people do move away from crime. So it's much easier to be humble, I think, when you know that you're right. And here what we can show is that we know that we're right. So here we go. They are men, obviously. Men commit far more offences than women. Women are the little black bits at the bottom. Women's peak offending around the age of 15, and they're moving away over life. And then up at the top, you've got men peaking around 17 to 21, and then moving. So over the life course, the vast majority of people move away from crime, and the vast majority do it of their own accord. Very, very quickly, I just wanted to show you that actually the shape of that curve holds fairly true across different offences. So one of the questions I often get when I teach on this in Cambridge is, okay, but is that the same for people who commit sexual offences? We don't know that much about it, and that is changing because a lot more people get convicted. But, this slide shows you, this is data from California, and it just shows that curve looks fairly similar for people who are convicted of sexual offences as well. So we can stand on some good evidence, actually, to say that people will move away from crime and that we can keep sticking to our ideals and keep loving people. And that, I think, leads me to praying in faith, being pure and unbounded in our love, being idealistic, we might say. So this is an example. If we go back to that age crime curve, the next slide explains what happens when people on that curve, on this bit, where people are moving away. So the study of desistance, movements away from crime, which is actually a misnomer, because when you talk to people who are in this process, they're not talking about moving away from crime, they're talking about moving towards something else. And one of the problems that they might have been encountering in that community is that there's little for people to move towards. So, no, but this is the reality, not just in that community, in community in general. We want people to move away from crime, but the process is actually one of moving towards. So on this slide, what you can see is what we know about people moving away from crime and what is important. So age and maturation is what I've showed you here on the age crime curve. As people grow older, they move away from crime, full stop. But what's happening within that? Well, there is some agency and some identity things happening. So who I am in the world, and therefore what I think I can do as a result of who I am, that is changing. It changes in interaction with social bonds, who I belong to. We know from lots of social science that our identity and our agency develops according to who we're around. But also who we're around influences what we can get involved in, the situations and the structures that we can get involved with and in, so the kinds of job opportunities we might have available. When I talked up front about love and what might love look like, when I got to writing this bit of the presentation, I thought to myself, okay, if we were doing that unbounded love, and if it meant that we were praying in faith, what do we think that faith is? And I thought of Hebrews 11:1. Faith is confidence in what we hope for. So we can be confident in it, doubt everything, hold on to the truth. We know people are moving away from crime. And assurance about what we do not see. That even though they might look like they're keeping offending, that there's a sense that we know this is going to happen over life. We know that they are going to move away from crime, and we know that these things are important. So even though they keep offending, maybe we could still be humble and stand on our faith and stand in love and keep reacting in that ideal way of saying, I'm going to choose to keep loving. And I think, again, if you look at this, that faith communities are ideally placed to do all of these things. My identity, I once was a sinner, but now I'm saved. What that means is that I belong to a family of lots of people who believe the same things as me and who accept me for who I am. And actually, within churches, there's a whole wealth of different social experiences and things and places that you can get involved in. I mean, even just the fact of walking into a church is a new social space for quite a lot of people and feeds into that identity and feeds into those bonds. But there's also very practical things, loads of job opportunities, lots of things that people can do. So churches are ideally placed to do some of that. As part of preparing for this lecture, I have started to read Martin Luther King's Strength to Love. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I would recommend it. Thank you to this lecture for bringing me to that book. One of the things that he was writing about in that, he has a chapter on love in action, which is one of his sermons. He talks about that, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He says within that, it's one of his sermons on it, millions of Negroes have been crucified by conscientious blindness. I have a sense in life, I've stood in Mexico on top of one of those pyramids where they used to ritually sacrifice people and thought, how did they ever think this was cleansing society? When I stand in our prisons, I often think that in many years to come, we're going to get tourists like me coming along going, they used to think that if you locked up these young boys in these little rooms when they were 15 and they've been lighting fires, that actually you would cleanse society and make it better. But what happened? It made things worse. So it might not be the slavery and the racism that Martin Luther King was talking about, but I do wonder if it might not be just as damaging for society. And I wondered if we did love God with what Martin Luther King says we should do, our hearts, our souls and our minds, if we did stand on these social science facts that people move away from crime, that those dangers of knowing not what they do might actually help us if we stopped trying to be probation officers, risk managers, if we stopped our chaplains in prisons trying to be prison officers and they started being chaplains instead, that what might happen if we stood on our ideals and actually were the church and prayed in that kind of faith. You know, when we know that links with family and friends for people in prison lead to far better reducing reoffending outcomes, why is it that every faith community is not providing 1 million addresses where people can stay if they want to go and visit their families in prison? Come stay with me, my home is open. You need to visit your family in prison? Come stay with me. Why is it that we're not offering lifts to people? You can't afford to get to prison? Yes, I could pick you up and I could take you there and drop you off. I am unconvinced that the risks of that outweigh what the benefits would be. Very quickly, people change together is my 5th take home, and that changed people change institutions. That is in brackets because I'm going to talk a little bit now about a study I'm currently doing, and we've only just started to measure the latter bit about how changed people change institutions. Within business research, there's quite a lot of research on that. What you'll see here is a picture of, is it John's? I think it is. I think it's St John's, and this is a Loudon Grange prison, I think, in Nottingham. One of the things that we have started doing on the back of some of that research that I was telling you about, roots out of crime, intergroup contact theory, and then also bringing in some educational theory, is to build communities of learning between universities and between prison, bringing our students together to study with each other. We are doing that because, quite frankly, I was doing a lot of work in prisons, I was doing a lot of work in universities, and I realised that there was some brilliance in our prisons that was not getting into my classrooms in university, and it was frustrating me because I needed some of those voices and experiences shaping some of the things we were learning in our classrooms and universities. And I also realised that in our prisons, the educational offering is pretty dire, and there are some excellent people taking 25 GCSEs because there's nothing on offer above that. And if they want to study at higher education level, first of all, they have to be 6 years to the end of their sentence, otherwise they can't get any funding for it. So if you've got a long sentence and you're brilliant, you're screwed. And secondly, that if you want to study at higher education, you have to study distance learning. Distance learning is less transformative. So we started learning together. These are the results of our research from learning together. These are things that our students have told us were changing, and we started to measure. And I can now tell you that across all of these things, self-esteem, self-efficacy, interpersonal efficacy, perspective-taking, connectedness, and future orientation, all things that are likely to map on to roots out of crime, but also to better futures for all of our students at university as well, going back to the grant study, they are all changing in statistically significant ways. What that means is it's unlikely to be happening by chance. But that is not the important finding. The important finding is this. And what this shows you is if you take 3 of those things and you put them into a statistical model, basically the magic is in the interpersonal. The change here is happening through the interpersonal. This is where the significance is happening in terms of changing self-efficacy. So if you go back to that agency and identity, who I am and what I want to do in life, if you go back to that sense that I can achieve that I can be in touch with people I know and that I can get into circumstances I know, what's called in a horrific academic phrase, diachronic self-control, but which actually means I can get myself by my will alongside people and into spaces where I can be the kind of person that I want to be. What this research is showing that we're currently doing is that the interpersonal is the thing that is driving those changes. It drives the changes in my sense of self, it drives my ability to take other people's perspectives on board, it drives my sense of what I want to do in life and the fact that I can achieve it. And it doesn't just drive that for our students who are in prison. It also drives it for our students who are at university. So this is a map of all of our students who continue. This is in a longitudinal study. We are following them up, who 2 years after they've studied together continue to be in touch with each other. The university students are in orange and the students who are in prison are in blue. And you will see that they are there are lots of different links going on, and they continue to feed into each other's lives in positive ways. We pushed and pushed when we started this initiative for continued contact, because we said we are not doing some kind of exploratory exertion into prisons for some experience of feeling good about ourselves. What we're doing is trying to build communities of learning where we can stay involved in each other's lives. We've now done it up and down the country. There are over 30 universities and prisons working in partnership with each other. And these are just some of the people. So Roscoe has got an immigration case that is going on, and he's nearly being deported. 10-year-old son who'll be left without him if he goes back, was a child soldier from the Congo. He's got an immigration lawyer because guess what? Alice's dad was an immigration judge, and so when Roscoe had problems, we rang Alice's dad and we said, Alice's dad, who would be the best immigration lawyer you ever had? And now he has a pro bono lawyer fighting his case. Gareth the other night called Alice up again, because Gareth was having a problem with his girlfriend and he was self-harming. But now he's got someone to call, and he said, can you come round? Because I'm self-harming and I need some help. Carol is a shy Asian Christian woman who really struggles to speak up in life. She sent us an email recently to say how much she was taking from her letters with the guys in prison who are continuing to struggle with things. And she said, I realise that at work I can try harder, I can do better, because these guys are doing it, so I can. Laura's working in the Ministry of Justice and has just moved to the Ministry of Defence and talks about how she carries these friends with her in everything that she does throughout her life. Claudia's in the prison inspectorate. John and Nick both went back to prison on recall. John is now out again, but we have a WhatsApp group. And what was really interesting is that as their lives were unravelling, they were able to share not just some of the good things they were doing. Often there's no forum for people to share what they're doing that is good when they've had offending pasts. But they were also able to share some of the struggles they were having, but know that they could still belong during it. They're staying in touch. Nick even sent a thank you card to his probation officer once he got recalled, because he felt that even though she'd recalled him, that she'd been really supportive. So that is a continuing and good relationship, which will help him when he gets out again, which won't be long. And why is all of that important? It's important because it means that we shouldn't just pray humbly and in love and in faith, but we should pray together. Not just together with people who are like us, but together with people who are not like us. So this little chart here is a way that I talk about Richard Sennett's work. He's an amazing geographer and social scientist, and he talks about how you build cities and how you build healthy cities and healthy communities. And he draws on natural sciences to say that actually if we build up walls, the kind of walls actually that you see here, hold on, oops. These walls that are keeping us all safe. He says what you see is that where you have walls like this in your cities and your communities, they actually mean that the community around them withers and dies, that it's not so healthy. And what he says is that we need to have the kinds of communities that can be porous, where they don't have boundaries, but they have borders, where we can let things in. And we see this from plant sciences, that we have to actually have membranes that are porous enough to let in the good stuff and keep out some of the bad things, right? So it's not that we're entirely without any kind of borders, but we actually need to do that. And what Richard Sennett says is where you see that in natural science throughout the world, where you see the beach coming into the shore, what you see is that it's difficult, it's challenging, it doesn't feel good. We've started to call it productive discomfort, and this is where the institutional transformation comes in. Because when you start getting people coming out of prison to your universities, you have to challenge all their risk management policies. Let me tell you, the ones at the University of Cambridge didn't make an awful lot of sense when we started trying to employ some of our students who are leaving and are well qualified. And you start asking questions of prisons. Actually, we have good evidence that continued contact is really important to the things that your institution is trying to achieve. Why is it that you're prohibiting it? And there's a way that you shape institutions through those things, but you have to expect that it's not going to be comfortable. And as I was writing this, it was making me think of the story of John Wimber. John Wimber was, I think, did he write You've Lost That Loving Feeling? It's definitely something I know about him. He was a bit of a party animal. He became a Christian. He started going to this church. He started the Vineyard movement. So he has died now, but this is in his book, which is worth reading. And he said he started going to this church, and then he started bringing all of his friends along with him. He was saying, well, this is amazing. Come along, come along. And then one day, one of the ladies in the church came up to him as the church was full of all these bikers with long hair and said, "You are ruining our church." And the problem is that we want change, but you can't change and stay the same. We often want change for others rather than change for ourselves. So take home 6 Desistance involves reoffending. This is the bit that we go back to that we were talking about earlier. So in the Sheffield desistance study, one of the things that Professor Tony Bottoms found was that you can be desisting and you might still reoffend. So these obstacles, you'll see this is a path of desistance here, and it comes round and there's a dark blue bit that's called relapse. And people might go round the circle again, or they might get out when they encounter a problem. So one of the things that we know is that people are going to reoffend as they go through the desistance cycle. So we shouldn't be shocked by that when it comes. But what they said in one of the papers where they write about this, and I quote, "When an obstacle is encountered, it might be successfully overcome, but frequently it is not. However, it is important to emphasise that succumbing to an obstacle does not necessarily lead to a complete relapse. It can simply be a partial setback, followed by further efforts to desist." One of the problems is actually that our criminal justice system really struggles to respond to those setbacks in ways that can help to keep people moving on in a positive direction. So the next thing that I think about prayer that this leads to is that you don't just pray in faith, but you have to keep on praying in faith. It's a little bit like the keeping on in humility. So this is a picture of Big G and Brian. These were two people who were in my study. Brian was a mentor. Big G had spent a lot of his life in prison. And they sent me this picture one day with the title, "It's a Miracle." And they sent it because it was a snowman in Houston in Texas, and they were telling me it's a miracle. But for me, what was more miraculous about this picture is that when Big G got out of prison in my study, Brian was his mentor. He went to church with Brian. Brian set him up with a job. He paid insurance on a truck for him. G went back to drug use and ended up back in prison. This picture was taken the day after he got re-released again, and Brian was still by his side. 5 years later, G died of cancer, but he stayed out of prison for those 5 years, and that was the longest 5 years he'd been out of prison. So he'd look like a failure if you looked at reoffending statistics. But what happened was that Brian risked trusting him. He said, "I'm going to keep trusting you, even though you're failing and messing up." And what that allowed was at the points that G was under a bridge after a crack binge, he would call Brian, he would get some help. It probably kept a lot of people safe. So it can be idealism, but maybe it works. It made me think of, again, something else Paul writes. There's a sense that actually our humility could extend maybe even into that. I have 2 further things to say. I need a book for them, which I've forgotten to get. If there are 2 things you should read, which is the next 2 books I'm about to tell you about, and I'm going to read you a little bit from each of them. Pray without ceasing. I think what that tells you that people reoffend is that we should always pray without ceasing. And I want to just read you a story. These books are written by a Jesuit priest who works with gangs in Los Angeles. They are beautiful books, and the director of my institute, I once told her about it. She read it on a train and she said, "Ruth, where do you find these books?" The man in front of me, she's very, very English and British. I have to put that in front. She's not someone who's, she's quite, her emotions are close to her. She said, the man in front of me had to put his arm around me and say, "Are you all right?" I was sobbing. But she said it was the best book she had read all year. So this is a story from this book. He says, so he's a Jesuit priest, works with gangs in Los Angeles, has started up all kinds of different industries working with people. There was a home girl, so a girl who's been involved in gangs, straight out of prison, with award-winning and alarming tattoos all over her face. She began work at the silk screen. First day, a fight. Second day, she came utterly illuminated on chronic marijuana. Third day, she arrived at work in a car filled with her homies. This is against our rules. Oh, and the car was stolen. This is against, well, everyone's rules. I suppose we could have fired her. And yet we decided, with all the no-matter-whatness we could muster, that she would give up on us long before we would give up on her. And give up she did. She just stopped showing up. We'll be ready for her when she comes back. You stand with the least likely to succeed until success is succeeded by something more valuable, kinship. You stand with the belligerent, the surly, and the badly behaved until bad behaviour is recognised for the language it is, the vocabulary of the deeply wounded and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Jesus looked irreparably at the purity code of the shot callers of his day. He recognised it was precisely this code that kept folks from kinship. Maybe success has become the new purity code, and Jesus shows us that the desire for purity, 9 times out of 10, is in fact the enemy of the gospel. Funders sometimes say, we don't fund efforts, we fund outcomes. We all hear this and we think how sensible, practical and realistic, hard-nosed and clear-eyed it is. But maybe Jesus doesn't know why we're nodding so vigorously. Without wanting to, we sometimes allow our preference for the poor to morph into a preference for the well-behaved and the most likely to succeed, even if you get better outcomes when you work with these folks. If success is our engine, we sidestep the difficult and belligerent and eventually abandon the slow work of God. Failure and death become insurmountable. In the end, he says, effective outcomes and a piling of success stories aren't the things for which we reach. Though who am I kidding? I prefer them to abject failure and decades of death. But it's not about preference. It's about the disruption of categories that leads us to abandon the difficult, the disagreeable, and the least likely to go very far. On most days, if I'm true to myself, I just want to share my life with the poor, regardless of the result. I want to lean into the challenge of intractable problems with as tender a heart as I can locate, knowing that there is some divine ingenuity here, the slow work of God that gets done if we are faithful. Maybe the world could do with a dose of the wrong-sized approach. Otherwise, the hurt wins. Maybe there aren't things that you can reach, but you can stretch your arm across a gurney and forgive and heal. Equal souls all day long. And the final take-home is that derailed desistance, what we saw last time when people mess up, can be re-railed. So with some colleagues, I wrote a paper which is entitled Fuck It. I make no apologies for that. It's what everybody said in the study, which was in America, in Australia, and in the UK, at the points that they had been trying to be these people coming down this curve. And they said, I can't succeed on my own terms, but what I can do is I can fail on my own terms. Back in 1964, there's a very famous criminologist called Matzer, and Matzer talked about fatalism, and he linked delinquency, people committing offences, to a mood of fatalism where you see yourself as cause, not effect. There's a way that we need to give people back respect, even in moments where they've messed up hugely, to be able to say to them, you can still be the author of your own success. You don't just need to be the author of your own failing. And what we found in that paper, most of it, which is about the ways that people unravel, but at the end of that paper, what we wrote were about the few examples from our studies where desistance derailing was re-railed. And we found that formal recognition of the efforts to succeed, even in the face of failure, can help to neutralise fatalism and to reignite hope. And that was massively important. And so I want to leave you with another story from the next book of Greg Boyle, which is Barking to the Choir. I love the title. And this is another story of another one of his homies. He says, homies often say, I was raised on the streets, but Monica truly was. Homeless, a gang member and a survivor. Her behaviour at home, boy, can often be alarming. She once kicked in our glass front door. On another particularly wild rampage, she went into our kitchen and began to gulp down all-purpose cleaner called Fabuloso. Fabulosa later became her nickname among the homies. Love that. Despite these outbursts, I hope she'll still get caught up in the rapture of the Holy Trinity, recovery, meds, and therapy. But you take victories where you can. I once corrected her for speaking with some harshness to one of the trainees. But that's why I told her to shut up, she said, stone-faced, instead of shut up, you fucking bitch. Progress. Or compels us to try and understand what language her behaviour is speaking. Judgment never gets past the behaviour. So that's where I want to end. Lost in wonder, love and praise. I wondered what would happen if we prayed in wonder and in praise. I remember my mum giving me a book. She gave me it at a particularly difficult time in my life. It was Victory on Praise Mountain. I don't know whether she will remember it, but I had just lost my sister. She had just lost her daughter. And I'm reading a book about why we should praise in all circumstances. But I wonder what would happen if you got your front door kicked in by someone who was the memory, and if you decided to praise. If you decided in that moment to think in awe and in praise. And I wonder if actually some criminologists might get to write an amazing paper about what might happen when you respond to challenges and to difficulties and to failure in awe, in wonder, in love and in praise, rather than in condemnation. Finally, I have this drawing in my office sent to me by someone who got out of prison. And as I was writing this week, I thought of the Good Shepherd. I just suddenly thought that picture at the background, you've got someone in front, I always think of him as at a bus stop, sort of down and out. And then you've got someone at the back just carrying one person on their back. And I wondered, what does it look like to leave the 99 and to go, to be in the gutter, to be the church of the descending Christ, and to be next to the people, to carry them, to pick them up, to go on. And it made me think about 1 Corinthians 13. If we apply it, we often hear that at weddings, but we don't often hear it in relation to people who are leaving prison. What would happen if we had that kind of love? And what Paul says is that it never fails. Thank you.